Good morning, everyone. Good to see you.
Good morning.
So many of you out today. I'm going to start with a question, which I usually do. And if your answer to my question is yes, I want you to turn your head to the left. And if your answer to my question is no, I want you to turn to the right. And if you think you're going to get away without responding, anybody who looks straight forward is going to be asked to stay and put away all the chairs. So don't try it. Okay, here's the question. So what was it? Left if what?
Yes.
Right if?
No.
No. You're at a party. Good time of year for parties, right? You're meeting people for the first time. You're getting involved in a little conversation in a small group. And somebody turns to you after the conversation goes on for a little while, and they say, "You sound pretty woke." Would you be mildly offended by that comment? Yes or no? Go. It's not a hard question. Well, that didn't work very well because a lot of people want to help with the chairs. Better to do chairs than to take an opinion or to take a stand. It's an interesting word. Unique. So I guess the next question would be, based on that unsuccessful experiment. The next question would be, is everybody awake? Okay, that's a good sign. I'll check back in about 30 minutes. But let's use that word in a slightly different way. When you awoke this morning, did you think, oh, good, I get to go hear Dr. Winters?
Yes.
Yeah. So awake, awoke, take off the A and you're left with woke, right? Which is our topic. So the literal definition is just being not asleep. Awake is not asleep, right? And it has a much richer metaphorical meaning, much more interesting than the literal dictionary. And it goes all the way back to the 40s. And some cultural icons back in that time used the phrase stay woke. Way back in the 40s. And then in 62, a musician said, if you're woke, you dig it. Remember that phrase, you dig it? So it connects with woke and dig it. More recently, in the 50s, 60s, and onward, stay woke or being woke was a part of the talk. You heard that expression, the talk, that African American parents give to their teenage sons and daughters. And the purpose of the talk is to keep them safe. Stay woke means being prepared for what could happen. So if you get stopped, if you're driving, you get stopped, stay woke. Don't move quickly. Don't ask questions of the officer. When you're reaching for your billfold, tell him, I'm going to reach for my billfold, that's where my license is. I'm going to do that now. I'm going to reach for the glove compartment and take out my registration. There's no gun in the glove compartment. So staying woke for teenage African American youth is all about staying alive. Be aware, be careful. So it's a very pragmatic, a very practical necessity for most African Americans in our society. But in the 60s and 70s, during the civil rights era, it took on a much broader meaning. And it started to permeate all of American culture and language. And it began to be associated with being aware of injustices. Stay woke for African Americans and other oppressed minorities was be aware of injustices. Be aware when somebody's taking advantage of you. Be aware if your rights are being violated. So staying woke took on a broader social, political meaning. More recently, in this century, it has been further broadened to include, and this is kind of a dictionary definition, It's a heightened awareness of social and political issues, inequalities, discrimination, and social justice. And in this decade, it's been expanded to include gender, sexuality, all kinds of inequality, racism, and any kind of oppression. So that four-letter word carries a lot of water. It's a very complex, rich, loaded word that started with something as simple as not being asleep to something much, much, much broader. So another way of saying it in the current environment that we're in now, it's consciousness of the world around you. Is that a bad thing? No. Consciousness of the world around you. Now, what's interesting about that phrase is who's you and what's your world? Are we all alike in that way? If you look at the political and the media landscape, do we all live in the same world? Clearly not. So it's an easy phrase, consciousness of the world around you, nothing wrong with that. But when you start seeing only parts of the world and you look at it from only your perspective, it's getting even more complicated. One of the problems that we have in our culture right now is the confusion of woke with politically correct. We don't hear that phrase very often anymore, do we? Maybe 5-10 years ago, it was a big deal. Remember how there's so much pushback? I can't say anything. I can't even tell a joke because it might not be PC. You're taking away my freedom of speech if I have to worry about being PC all the time. Give me a break. Is woke the same as PC? Not really.
No.
Not really. PC was a fairly cheap, in my opinion, cheap way of kind of shutting down the conversation or complaining about something that's not really a big deal. But woke is far more complex. The other problem is that some people want you to believe that woke is a movement. Wait, how do we go from a word to a concept to a movement? To me, that's a real stretch. But it's a very convenient way of overgeneralizing, categorizing, and dismissing lots of people when you say that it's a movement. Because what's behind the word movement is what? Threat. A movement to do what? A movement that's trying to take what away from me. So somehow shifting it to the idea of a movement is problematic when you think about where we started. The term co-opted is an interesting one to me. Have you heard some debate about cultural appropriation, where white people wear dreads or black people get white hair? I mean, it kind of goes all over the place. Or, white singers playing Native American music. That's a very controversial topic, but it's related to co-opted. If you co-opt something, you take something away from somebody else and make it your own. So one of these days, somebody's going to co-opt Les and take him to another organization like this and say, he is so good, we're taking him away. We've got use for him over here. But co-opting is a very serious issue. And what I find interesting about woke is that it's so threatening to some people that they felt the need to co-opt it, take it away, redefine it, and make it disappear. That's how threatening it has become to some people. I used to tell my graduate students, go ahead and take the call, just put it on speaker so we can all hear the conversation. That's okay. So how do we know that it's been co-opted? how do we know that the concept of woke has become threatening to some parts of our society? Have you heard the term woke movement? Woke bureaucrats. The last thing we want is a woke bureaucrat. Wokeness. Now it's a noun all of a sudden. It was an adjective for a long time. Now it's wokeness. How about a mind virus? Is that a little bit extreme?
Mind virus.
Mind virus. In other words, be careful because wokeness could infect your brain. Be careful. Watch out for wokeness. It's very dangerous. It's a mind virus. If you're following the news, you know where that came from, but I'm not going to get political today, so I'm going to get political, but not partisan political. So I'm not going to say who said that. How about a woke idiot? No judgment there, right? So now all of a sudden, if you're woke, you're also an idiot. Can you be too woke? Can you be too conscious of the world around you? I'm not sure how that works. I think of woke is something in the direction of intelligence, and anti-woke is sort of the directions of ignorance or closing your mind or closing your eyes. But I'm not sure how you get to be too woke. Interesting question in my mind. But probably worst of all, some commentators, some politicians have referred to it as a cult. That's pretty low, isn't it? A cult, really? So when you say that something is a cult, you've elevated it to a what? A religion. I think that's a long way to go. I mean, you have to be really freaked out by the idea of being woke to go that far, to cast it as a religion. I find that really interesting. So beyond the dynamic of woke, and by the way, let me just stop for a minute and go back to my anthropology and linguistics roots to acknowledge that words change. Language is never static. And those who try to protect language are doomed to fail because there is no way to protect language. It moves on. Old words take on new meaning. There's nothing new about that. For example, my mother-in-law back in the 60s and 70s used the word gay quite often. And she was a first grade school teacher and really was not that aware of what's going on in the world. And her daughter kept saying, "Mom, you can't say that." Why not? You know what that means. Well, guess what? It means something. I mean, some words have their old meaning, but then they have a new meaning, right? And that's just the nature of language. So why am I going on and on and on about woke if that's just the way language works? Well, in this case, it's not just the way language works. Because the term has been co-opted, it's been redefined, and most importantly, it's been weaponized. What does weaponize mean? You know what weapon means? Weaponize means to take something fairly neutral and turn it into something that can be used to kill people. So, for example, bacteria exists in all organisms, right? But can bacteria be weaponized? Sure. Yes, they definitely can. What about something about chemicals? Chemicals are used in thousands of ways to support our lifestyle. But can chemicals be weaponized? Of course they can. You know that. So that's kind of a literal scientific definition of what it means to weaponize. But more recently in this century and maybe the end of the last century, people have learned to weaponize words, weaponize concepts, weaponize ideas. The far right, the extremist right, the anarchists have learned through the internet, the facility of the internet, they figured out how to use words to cause people to kill other people. That's what extremists have been able to do, whether it's terrorists, idealists, anarchists. It's not unusual because of the facility that the internet provides for skillful people to use words to create violence. So we are living at a time of the weaponization of words, which is far different from just redefining it, isn't it? You see the difference? Language, linguistics, culture, language evolves. But when words are intentionally used as weapons, we're in a different domain. Words have taken on a different dimension. In politics, you probably noticed in the last few years that metaphor of weaponization has also been applied to elements of government, which I find really challenging to get my head around. Have you heard the phrase weaponizing the judiciary? How about weaponizing the federal government? I'm thinking, wait a minute, that metaphor doesn't, in my mind, doesn't work. Because that assumes that somebody can manipulate the judiciary, manipulate the federal government to do certain things. I hope that's not true. We all better hope it's not true. But extremists have figured out that through media, it is possible to not just change the definition, change the way the word is used, but to turn it into an instrument of violence or power. In the research I did for today's presentation, I came across several posts, several articles that helped me understand why some people are so opposed to the idea of woke, which is unfortunate because some advocates, some self-styled proponents of being woke, in some cases have gone too far. So for some, woke has become an instrument in the other direction. In other words, some people present themselves as woke to the extreme. So they present themselves as perfect, superior, self-righteous, and have appointed themselves as the culture police. That's unfortunate anyway. When you start with something positive, something potentially good for society, and if you carry it too far, there can be backlash. I just read an article from the Atlantic this morning about a professor at the University of Michigan who was an immigrant from Russia. So he grew up and was educated under that kind of a regime where ideas were dangerous, where he could be imprisoned or executed for ideas, for speaking, for expressing his opinion. So when he got to the United States, as by the way, a legal immigrant, he was a professor in the mathematics department at the University of Michigan. And what he learned was that for new professors, he was a tenured professor, but for new professors to get onto the faculty at the University of Michigan, they had to write an essay, a position paper about inclusion and equality. That offended him. He said, even if you were to tell me that I had to write a paper on water is wet and why it's wet, I would still object, because I shouldn't be told what I have to say or what I have to express or what I have to accept as right, proper, appropriate, effective. I thought it was a really interesting position that he took. Should he be forced to express his wokeness? I would have to say no. Because if you're going to use it, if you're against using it as a tool, if you're against using it as a weapon, wouldn't you object to being forced to use it on either direction? And isn't that logical? That if you don't subscribe to the idea of weaponizing, it doesn't matter who's using it, I'd rather not see that happen. So it's unfortunate that some people who are opposed to change, opposed to promoting the ideas of being woke, are able to capitalize on some few, I think, who maybe carry it too far and who force people to adopt their way of thinking. The idea of weaponization is interesting, and it's not necessarily new. I just watched a series recently of part of it took place in the 50s during the McCarthy era. And it struck me that the word communism was weaponized back in the 50s. Any historian, any political scientist would tell you that there was absolutely no danger of the United States becoming communist in the 50s. And in retrospect, that idea was ludicrous. There really was no danger. But that word communism became a very powerful, blunt tool that destroyed many people's professional lives. And it also destroyed many lives, period, because the number of people who committed suicide who were under investigation. The weaponization of concepts, in this case, I don't think it's the word itself, it's the concept behind the word that most people did not understand. So it was easily used as a very powerful political weapon to promote a certain position, a certain perspective, a certain belief system about government and culture. It was used against liberals, it was used against Jews, it was used against homosexuals, it was used against all kinds of nonconformists. So we have a history of weaponization, and we have lessons to learn from. How does that happen? How do you go from something which I think is a virtue, well, to me is a virtue, how do you move from that to weaponization? Well, the first thing that happens, I think if you ponder this for a minute, you can see the many examples. The first step in that process is to see that the word is overused. It just starts popping up all over the place. And pretty soon you begin to notice that, wait a minute, it just keeps popping up, but every time I see it, it sounds like something different. That's a very effective method on the road to weaponization. It gets used by people who don't know what it means, who use it incorrectly, who add connotations and implications to the word that are not there until somebody creates them. So when a term gets to be overused, that should be a red flag for good consumers of information, that maybe there's something going on here. CRT comes to mind as a really good example.
What's CRT?
Critical race theory.
Oh, yes.
That's a very good example of how this process works. So CRT goes back to the 80s in a law school with a law professor who said that in order to understand how racial inequalities are perpetuated in our society after the civil rights legislation, we need to be able to look at this, analyze it, and understand it better. So he said, race plays a critical role in society, in the way institutions function. So if we really are serious about understanding our society and our institutions and the persistent inequality in our system, we need to be able to look at the importance of race. So critical in the sense that it's critically important to see the role of race if you want to understand what's going on. You see anything wrong with that? But keep in mind, this is for law students, which is a graduate level of education. Right? So this professor included CRT in his law courses to help his future lawyers to better understand the dynamics of society. Was CRT taught in other parts of the university? No. Fast forward, this is 80s. Fast forward to the 2010s. Was critical race theory being taught in law schools around the country? A few, not all. Was it taught in other departments? Rarely. Referenced maybe in the context of a bigger discussion, but not taught as a class. Has CRT ever been taught at the high school level? No. No, it wasn't taught at the high school level. And yet, we have a political movement that says we need to pass laws to prohibit teaching CRT in high schools. Do we? Do we need a law that does that? Well, what happened along the way? CRT got repeated hundreds of times in political and media discourse. Hundreds. But if you really go to YouTube and go do some research on this, you'll find clips where people are asked, critics, advocates of these laws to prohibit CRT, they're asked to define CRT, and guess what? No, they can't. They can't. That's not the point. The point is not what does it mean. The point is not where was it taught. The point is not is it dangerous or not. The point is it became a weapon in political discourse. It became a category or a concept of, oh my gosh, we can't possibly teach students at any level about the realities of prejudice and discrimination, race. We can't go there. Why can't we go there? Why are some people so against teaching all of American history, not just the good part? Have you thought about that? When you overuse it, it loses its meaning. In this case, it never had the meaning people thought it did. But whatever meaning it did have, it gets lost in the shuffle, right, in the overuse. Then it gets used in a different context, go from CRT in a law school to CRT in universities to CRT in high school and CRT in elementary school. So we use it in all these different contexts, which has a very effective result of confusing people. Wait a minute, what is this really about? Doesn't make sense to me. The implications and the inferences that are attached to the word or the phrase or concept become more and more irrelevant to what it really means. That people are easily convinced to take on those biases, those inferences, and those implications without knowledge of what the word really means. So it becomes entirely negative. Ask any politician if there's anything positive about CRT and what is the answer going to be. Wouldn't it be political suicide to take a position as a politician that CRT is a good thing? It would be a poison pill. So I think CRT is a good example of how the weaponization of a concept can be used to kill ideas, kill concepts. So weaponization has taken on a much more significant meaning in my mind in our current media culture because of the power that it has. So CRT was weaponized with the intention of promoting or discouraging discourse, promoting or discouraging change, promoting or discouraging justice. So you have to ask yourself, how does this happen? How do they, I don't want to get into who they is, you figure that out yourself, but how did they get away with it? How does this work? Why is it so easily done? Part of it's being systematic, part of it is knowing the truth, but conveying something different.
I didn't understand.
There's a lot of ways and contexts in which this can become beneficial to some groups. But behind all of it, in my way of thinking, those who oppose change feel threatened by change. And the reason that woke and CRT and some of the other weaponized concepts are so dangerous is because I don't want things to change. Who who in our society is most likely to say, I don't really want things to change?
That is.
Yeah, who benefits from the status quo?
Rich people.
Rich people,
White people.
white people, old people. Leave us alone, we're talking about everybody else. We're not talking about them. Don't go. But what about the oppressed? What about the marginalized? What about ethnic or religious minorities? Are they standing up and saying, please, please, no change, everything's fine? How many times have you heard the research where they ask white people if things are better when it comes to racism? 80% of white people that are polled say, yes, in my lifetime, things are much better for Black people than they were when I was a kid. Full stop, end of story. Guess what happens when they ask African Americans that question? 80% say, no, it's not better. We want to believe that things are better, but we don't necessarily want to look at the data. We don't necessarily want to look at income inequality, educational inequality, job discrimination.
Do they ask old Black people?
Well, it might be a slightly different.
Civil Rights Act.
Well, the important thing about the Civil Rights Act is that it didn't change society, it changed the law. And you can't legislate woke. You can't force people to be more conscious of the world they live in. And so legally, the Civil Rights Act were very important, and nobody denies that. But structurally, there was nothing in the Civil Rights Act that forced the government or businesses or universities to change the way they did business. And the unintended consequence of the Civil Rights Act was to put everything underground. You couldn't be overly racist without being a bad person. You couldn't discriminate in job hiring. You've got to say the right things, but when you interview people, you still know how to get what you want. And so that's one of the reasons that woke has become so controversial. Because the people who consider themselves woke would like to see more people in our society to become more woke about the injustice and inequalities, is because then we could really get serious about the business of creating the society that we think we have. And so this residue of resentment, going back to the civil rights period, is manifesting itself again in this discussion about woke. It's the same thing about avoiding change, don't make me do things, don't make me think certain things, which is reasonable. I mean, who among us, except me, of course, can tell you what to think, right? I'm the exception. No, but seriously, we don't get to tell each other what to think necessarily. But can we create arguments? Can we provide evidence? Can we provide logic? Can we do what we're doing today and go back and look at the word, what it means, what it doesn't mean? So that's, to me, not the same as telling you what to think. It's asking you to think. And to me, that's what woke is about. Asking you to think, asking you to look, asking you to go below the surface and get to the root of things. So if you're wired like I am, you like definitions, you like to think you know what the word means, but let me check just in case I don't get it right. So how would you define weaponization when it comes to words, concepts, and ideas? My intent to describe it, since it's not something that's really out there in terms of the Webster's dictionary, it's an intentional power play to undermine change and to perpetuate injustice, to disparage the oppressed, and to protect the privileges. Weaponization is primarily designed to stop change. Okay, so who cares? If you're not a word person like I am, if you're not a sociologist or an anthropologist or a political scientist, why should you care about weaponization of words? My answer to that question would be, because in the next few months, we're going into another election cycle. How can you responsibly exercise your right to vote if you're not aware of weaponization? To some extent, would it be fair to say that we've all been victimized to some extent by weaponization? In the way we think and what we read, potentially even how we vote. Because weaponization does not encourage inquiry. It does not encourage asking thoughtful questions. It does not encourage research. And it does not encourage confronting the misuse of important words. Those who weaponize words, concepts, and ideas don't want you to do any of those things. But if you're going to survive, and I hope we all do, the next election cycle, I feel very strongly that we all need to sharpen our ability to spot weaponization when it occurs. So to me, it's all about being a citizen. It's all about how we vote. It's all about how we engage in conversations with each other. One of the easiest ways to discover if you're in a conversation with someone, whether they are aware that a word has been weaponized, whether they're aware of how they're using the word, is one very simple question. How do you define that word? That is a very scary thing for some people. Please don't ask me that question. I'm perfectly comfortable using the word. I'm perfectly comfortable hearing the word. I'm perfectly comfortable telling you that you should care about this word. Just don't ask me to define it. You see what that does? It takes away all this outer shell. We all know what that means. We all know why it's important. We all know that's a bad thing. Do we? And I think you can do that in a fairly non-confrontational way versus you're really stupid for thinking that. That doesn't work so well. You know, you want to say that sometimes, but probably not a good idea. But is it fairly acceptable to ask somebody, okay, define, maybe that's too academic for your friends, but could you just tell me what that word means to you? Is that a threatening question? Depends on how you say it. Tell me what that word means to you. God, not so good. But you can do it in a very neutral way.
I'll tell you what it means to me, is that to me for many years. The first time I heard it was woke tailors. And that was a custom tailored suits in London.
Leave it to Mary to get us completely on top. That would be a good starting point, okay? Yeah, it means tailor, so start with that and then go on and say, but when we hear it in the news, what do you think it means? When you hear it in a political debate, a presidential debate, what do you think it means? So I would propose that not only do you as an individual citizen and voter be more aware of weaponization of words, but I would encourage you as you interact with other people to help them see the dangers and the power of weaponized words. So to me, that's why all this matters. It's not just as an observer, passive observer of the insanity that we live in, but beyond that, when you have a chance to vote, make it count based on what's real, not based on what's being given to you. So I'd like to take a few minutes to ask you if you can think of some examples of weaponized words that I haven't mentioned.
I'm just saying, you did mention CRT, but I'm wondering if CRT led to this era of book banning and what's happening.
Now, the question was, did CRT lead in some ways to book banning? I think CRT is a part of a dynamic process that leads to book banning and book burning, but I don't think CRT as the head of the arrow. It wasn't really the point of the arrow, but the idea of the book banning is very much related to what we were discussing. Is It's one group telling another group what you can and cannot do, what you can and cannot think. So would you guess, tempting to overgeneralize, and I'm bad at, I'm good at doing that, and I shouldn't be, but would it be fairly safe to assume that the majority of people who promote book banning also oppose change? Is that a fairly safe assumption? Because it's the opposite, whoa, isn't it? Yeah. In my world, the world around you, any attempt to limit people's access to ideas, information, is kind of the opposite of woke. And it goes back to this idea of who are we protecting? Whom are we protecting? Who benefits from the status quo? And one of the things we know about white supremacy is that white supremacy, the way it functions in society, has mastered the ability to protect itself. That's one of the reasons that white supremacy doesn't go away, because the dynamics of white supremacy in society has an advanced, built-in mechanism for self-preservation. I mean, I know I'm talking about like a person, and I don't need to do that, but if you look at it sociologically, from a political science perspective, the dynamics of white supremacy are very, very powerful with self-preservation. And that means no change. Don't change the way you teach history. Don't change the institutions that have benefited me all my life. It happened with women's suffrage, for example. Wasn't that all about preserving privilege for men, right? And the interesting thing about some change, I'm not going to, I can't stand here and say that all change is good, but these major shifts can be beneficial to everybody. If there's justice for everybody, does that take anything away from me? If there are fewer poor people on welfare and we raise people up, does that take money out of my pocket? Or does that allow my taxes to be used in a different way? And so we have built in our Western civilization, our American psyche, we have built in a default assumption that if you get ahead, I fall behind. In mathematics and in economics, that's called the zero-sum game. There's only so much money in the world. If you get more, I get less. Well, guess what? In the meantime, the government's printing more money. So no, you're getting ahead doesn't mean I'm getting behind. But this is really deep in our psyche. So the idea of change being threatening to some has to do with their position in society. So book burning is a kind of an extreme example of trying to stop change. New authors, new writers, new perspectives, new experiences, we don't need it. Yes.
The big word that got weaponized in my life and confused me greatly was liberal. Because I always thought it meant open-minded. And so I was proud to be liberal, and I got a liberal education and celebrated my own open-mindedness, and suddenly I was, aspersions were cast on my liberalism. I'm still dealing with that.
Well, I think that's a very good example. Liberal in your adolescence and early college days, liberal was probably just, liberal. What's the big deal? Not anymore, I should point out. But couldn't we say the same thing of conservative? Has that been weaponized? So there's no free, go past jail, get out of jail free card here. I mean, the weaponization can go both ways.
Just quickly to follow up, the word weaponized is being weaponized.
Even to John to come up with that. But it's true. Well, going back to that example, weaponizing the judiciary, weaponizing the federal government. Yeah.
Isn't deep state and weaponizing?
Deep state, that's a good one.
That's-
Yeah. What the heck does that mean? What does it mean? I have no idea. I don't think. Thank you for bringing that up, because I don't think deep state means anything. But is it a useful tool? Is it a good way to scare people? Yeah, absolutely. So it doesn't have to mean anything. It can still be useful.
Artificial intelligence.
Artificial intelligence. Yes.
Can you use the word woke in what recently happened in Congress with the three university presidents refusing to answer particular questions?
Well, that's a whole nother discussion, but his question was about woke and the recent testimony in Congress and the president of Harvard University and the calls for her termination and the fact that the board unanimously voted to keep her in her position. And what's happened with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is that, how do I say this? Woke is being redefined as we speak. Because for some people, being woke about that is supporting Israel 100%. For others, remember that phrase I used before? About a consciousness of the world around you? Well, some people's consciousness takes you to an operational definition of woke as being totally supportive of Israel. But another version of woke says, wait a minute, people are dying on both sides. There's aggression on both sides. So can you be supportive of Palestinians without being anti-Semitic? The problem with woke is it's too darn complicated. But that's a very good example of how complex it becomes. To me, the real issue is if we can discuss it, we're making progress. If you try to shut me down, which is what happened to this university president, if she has any kind of sympathy with Palestinians, then she's not woke and shouldn't be president. That's like that professor who said I shouldn't have to write a paper about inclusion to get my job. It's very, very difficult, very, very complicated.
And president of the University of Pennsylvania was recently resigned. She was let go. So there are two examples.
Same controversy?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, well, if you're on the board, would you want to be on one of those boards to make that decision? I would. Yes.
It's helpful for me when I think about woke and this general topic of how words get weaponized, is to think about fear, because fear is often the underlying dynamic. Woke, the weaponization is used to create fear. Unfortunately, I believe in our culture, we're not good at coping with fear. Probably the world isn't either. And I think we should be teaching our kids and ourselves how to cope with fear.
Thank you for bringing that up. What's the antidote of fear? How do you make fear go away? Information, knowledge, understanding. Trust. Exactly. And so you go back to the 50s and the Red Scare and all the horrible things that were done in the name of freedom, democracy, et cetera. It was all about fear. Yeah. And I think it's legitimate for some people to fear change. I think that's part of being human, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
But if you want people to be more comfortable with fear, be more comfortable with change, they deserve real information, knowledge, understanding. And that's why we're in so much trouble now with the mediaocracy that we live in. It's because the information part doesn't come. The fear part's easy, it's marketable, it's impactful. The knowledge part is a little more complicated, takes a little more time, and it's not happening. Yes.
Mine have been here as well, my question. But there is also helping people to look back at times of change and what the opportunities were that resulted, and helping them to see that as an antidote for fear.
Excellent. She said that if we could encourage people to go back in our history to when there was huge disruptive change in our society, then we can look back and see all the good that came from that. If people could have that assumption now, assume that there will be potentially there's good things coming out of the change we're living in now, there would be less fear. Good point. Yes.
I was just gonna say that I think that the repetition of words, are the main tool of weaponization. If people hear the same thing enough times from one person, especially, over and over, it sticks. We know that about the way propaganda works and the way commercials are created. So I think the way our media works, when we use a word like woke or use a phrase like CRT over and over again in a weaponized way, then no matter how bright a person is, if they let themselves succumb to it, they can eventually, it sticks in their head like a song that we can't stand, but we can't get it out of our head.
Yeah. Good point. That's why repetition doesn't sound that harmful, but in fact it can be, yes.
In a open society, is there any way to address the profitability of fear?
Well, the word that comes to mind is censorship. And in that case, the solution becomes worse than the problem.
Sure.
So the way I see it is that our ability as citizens to change the way the media works or to change the profit dynamic of fear is fairly pointless. But what we can do is own our own role in that. We have to make the effort to be informed if we choose to. And if enough people do that, then voting will come out a different way. It's going to be really interesting this next election cycle to see if all the craziness results in change politically. And part of that comes back to individuals. Yes.
When I was growing up, it seemed like we were encouraged to make choices, good choices, do the right thing, plan ahead, and sort of thing. And it seems sort of like, maybe you can address it. It seems like recently we're kind of pushed into being one or the other. In other words, when you opened the conversation, your program, you said, well, now people look this way to answer yes or no, and look that way to answer yes or no. We're being boxed in, it feels like, to either be for it or against it. And if I'm for it and you're against it, you're my enemy.
Good point. I appreciate you bringing that up. It was like a trick question. Yeah, it oversimplifies. And that's part of our problem with media. When things are not simple, and you only have 30 seconds, guess what? You oversimplify, right? So it's up to us to fight that. The other interesting thing about your comment in terms of the political dynamic that we're living in is that if you came to this country from some remote part of the world where you didn't have a lot of media, you would assume that America is on the verge of a civil war because there's two extremes and everybody knows you're either one or the other, right? Is that your point? Is that the reality? It feels like that. But the reality is the great majority of Americans are in the middle. Would you know that from the political story? Would you know that from the mediaverse? Because normal, reasonable, reliable is boring. It doesn't sell. And that's very cynical, and I don't need to be that negative, but I think that's part of this proper dynamic is that we just have to keep reminding ourselves that sanity does exist in the middle. But our system doesn't work so well in manifesting that in political outcomes for a variety of reasons. Yes.
Well, I think we're also, there's a great deal to be said about how much money is being made by creating a sense of fear in the American public, because we tend to buy more when we're in a state of fear. So consequently, if we can be manipulated to be in that state, it helps the economy to some degree. And the people that are gaining the most on top right now, which we can see, is a tremendous, no, but it's a tremendous boost in all of that because of all the fear.
Fear promotes good business. Fear promotes profit. Fear promotes consumption.
So there isn't a political motivation on either side to some degree to bring us out of fight or flight. as a nation, which is troubling to me. As far as looking at the idea of that these things that go much deeper than just the political party.
That's more than politics, that neither extreme is particularly attracted to the idea of reducing fear, because it creates votes, it creates funding, it creates all kinds of dynamics, both in business and in politics. Just about to get the hook, one more question.
I really appreciate this discussion and your presentation, because I think it's one of the antidotes to the problems we're talking about. When people get together face to face and discuss things, we figure out what's behind all of the games that are being played. So thank you.